We're back talking with Irũngũ Houghton, Executive Director of Amnesty International Kenya. And we were just talking about some of those issues that have catalyzed progress. Let's talk about, in regard to those issues and also others where we've not made a lot of progress. Which ones do you think we have good data on? And which ones do you think we need to do a lot more?
So I think traditionally, first of all, just say I'm a great lover of data, and data is critical for both activists and also policymakers. I think we've probably done much better in the kind of data that we collect traditionally in our census. So numbers of women, age groups, ethnicity. So I guess what you call the biodata stuff. Yeah. That's fairly well taken care of. It's much more difficult, I think, to find material on that which society still does not accept. Right, obviously. So the number of rape cases and sexual assault cases are, mostly, in most cases, underreported, simply because the stigma that's attached to reporting. And at that point, you are probably relying on police data rather than data of people that are providing non-law enforcement support. So I think that's been much more challenging. The other thing I think is traditionally we still see data as coming from specific parts of society, so from the National Bureau of Statistics, for example, or the public offices like the police. There is very little integration of data, and I think that's where the challenge is. So non-state actors come into contact with lots of cases of violations, but they are not well positioned to bring that to the state organs, for state organs to incorporate that in terms of the national statistics. And that's, I think, one of the bigger challenges.
So your citizen-generated data, doesn't make its way into this.
Yeah, and this is particularly painful given what we've seen in terms of crowdsourcing of data and open data, campaigns across the continent. Because technically speaking now, we have the devices to make that much easier. And there are organizations that are doing wonderful work in this area. And I think what's missing really is to have their data brought in. And I know there's a huge debate between reputable data and others. So I think that's integration of those data sources is probably the second most important issue. The third one I think relates to the explosion of big data. And I think this is where probably we have not deployed this new capacities around connectivity, around artificial intelligence, the ability to simulate reality and the future. We've not really brought that energy into the women's rights movement or into gender justice work. So not just to document what has happened or what the status is currently, but to think about what will Africa look like 5 to 10 years from now. So historically, I think we've used probably 3 major sources. And this is in my previous work with Oxfam. We used the Mo Ibrahim Index quite dramatically. We used the Afrobarometer analysis, which we liked very much because of its fluidity and ability to work with perceptions. Thirdly, we've used the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa Gender Index, which was the other project that was there, which I believe I don't think it's still going. I think it's wound up now. And the fourth one really has been, I think, the UN Women analysis that's done annually and released annually. But I think the problem is that many of those institutions are essentially collating data that is generated for the national level. So where traditionally we don't have good, well-resourced research and development programming at the level of the nation, what you get at the continental level will be weak.
And that of course makes it so that those working at the national level and sub-national level have very weak data, very weak evidence to work with, whether it's quantitative or qualitative. For their advocacy and for policy.
But I'm going to be a bit heretic here maybe and provocative. So in Oxfam we used to have something called killer facts. And a killer fact was essentially a set of 5 facts that we would generate based on data. And out we may look at, I don't know, maybe 400 datums or anecdotes or facts. And we would identify just 5. And then we would position them in a way in which it would actually generate a sense of vigilance and a sense of outrage. And we found that much more useful than overloading people with 100 pieces of data. So just to give you an example, we at one point produced an analysis in terms of how many women die every day in childbirth across the continent. Now, if we had simply said the number of women that die every year is X, it doesn't have the same impact as simply saying every 15 minutes, every 1 hour, every 1 day, this is what's happening to women across the continent.
Yeah.
And I think that also is critical. Now, of course, that has to rely on the backbone of reliable data, right? But I think being able to manage the data in a particular way makes it real for basic, for ordinary citizens. The second thing I think is thinking through a little bit about, in those days in 2003, we didn't have, I guess, infographics. We didn't have the concept of audio-visual representation.
Yeah, and some of these more interesting data visualizations that we see,
we didn't have that
online.
Yeah. I mean, it was revolutionary.
Clickable.
It was revolutionary in those days to produce a policy brief that was 15 pages.
Yes.
Right. People said it had to be 50 pages or 200 or.
And that was why it was brief.
That was called a brief, right? Because we realized that actually people don't read more than 15 pages.
Yeah.
I think now, the capacity of our policymakers and our activists and citizens to go beyond a tweet or to go beyond a image is even less, right? So I think for us now, what we need to think about is what stories are we telling that are not only verifiable, factual, but also generate a sense of imagination about what could be rather than what is. And I think that's the challenge now for data producers and data users.
That capacity to do that, we've typically seen it only with the most sophisticated organizations.
Yeah.
And yet those working at the grassroots, those working at the subnational level, who are at the front lines who could really benefit from this usually don't have the capacity. Yeah. How do we close that gap?
So there's two things there. One is that communities, particularly African communities, are oral. So we were storytelling, way below, before Oxfam and ActionAid started doing policy briefs and,
visualization.
Government started doing, national plans and stuff like that. So storytelling is really part of our culture. And I think the more we're able to generate those stories. So the story of Nuria of Sudan is powerful by itself, right? It doesn't need to be backed up by, there are 100,000 Nurias across the continent. It is important to get a sense of scale because that allows policymakers to plan how to use resources and also for activists to work out how to create systems and platforms where they can protect 100,000 people. But I think the important thing is that, people are moved to act by individual stories primarily. So capturing that story powerfully is really part of our work now.
All right. I think that's also an opportunity to not just to reimagine, but to strengthen the existing capacity for storytelling that's already there.
That's already there.
We can already do this. Right. So when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about your vision for Maputo's next 15.
Yeah, correct.
We'll be back.